Commodities Institute podcast. I'm Emily Costa, and today is Friday, March 13th, 2026. Over the past several days, commodity markets have been moving at an extraordinary pace, from oil markets rattled by conflict in the Middle East to rising tensions in the global iron ore trade, and even shipping disruptions that are slowing agricultural exports. The story across commodities right now is really about one thing: supply chains under stress. Today we're going to walk through the major developments shaping the commodities landscape right now and what they could mean for prices, trade flows and global markets in the weeks ahead. Let's begin with oil, because that's where the most immediate shock has emerged. The ongoing conflict involving Iran has created one of the most serious disruptions to global energy flows in modern history. The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow but critically important waterway, normally carries roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply. When shipping through that corridor slows or stops, markets react immediately. In the past 2 weeks, benchmark oil prices have just above $100 per barrel, reflecting fears that supplies from the Middle East could remain constrained. The shock has rippled quickly into consumer markets. In the United States, gasoline prices have climbed to around $3.60 per gallon, the highest level in nearly 2 years. Diesel prices are even more elevated, approaching $5 per gallon. Faced with rising fuel costs, the US government is now considering several emergency measures to stabilize markets. One option being discussed is a temporary waiver of the Jones Act. This is a shipping law that dates back more than a century and requires goods moving between American ports to be carried on ships that are built in the United States, flagged in the United States, and largely owned by American companies. While the law was originally designed to support domestic shipbuilding and maritime jobs, it also limits the number of vessels available for domestic shipments. Waiving the rule for about 30 days would allow foreign ships to move fuel and agricultural products between US ports, potentially lowering transportation costs and speeding deliveries. Analysts say the move might not dramatically reduce gasoline prices, but it could slow the rate of increase. In regions that rely heavily on imports, such as the US West Coast and the Northeast, even a few cents per gallon could make a difference for consumers. However, the proposal is controversial. Maritime labor unions argue that shipping costs are not the primary driver of fuel prices. Instead, they say global crude prices remain the dominant factor. At the same time, Washington has introduced another temporary measure that is raising eyebrows across global energy markets. The US Treasury has issued a 30-day waiver allowing the purchase of Russian oil that is currently stranded at sea. The goal is straightforward: increase available supply quickly to calm markets rattled by the Middle East conflict. There are roughly 124 million barrels of Russian oil floating on tankers around the world. Allowing those cargoes to be delivered could provide several days of additional global supply at a time when disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz are removing barrels from the market. But the move also carries geopolitical implications. European leaders have warned that relaxing restrictions on Russian oil, even temporarily, could undermine efforts to reduce Moscow's energy revenues. Meanwhile, the International Energy Agency and its partners are also stepping in. A coordinated release of emergency oil reserves is now underway, totaling about 400 million barrels globally, including more than 170 million barrels from the US Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Taken together, these steps illustrate just how serious the supply shock has become. Now let's shift to metals, where tensions between China and major miners are beginning to reshape iron ore trade. China has expanded restrictions on certain iron ore products from one of the world's largest suppliers. Domestic steel mills and traders have been told they will soon be prohibited from taking delivery of a popular iron ore grade known as Newman fines stored at ports. This marks the latest step in a months-long dispute over supply contracts for the upcoming year. Over the past 6 months, Chinese authorities have gradually limited purchases of several iron ore grades from the same producer. The latest restriction further narrows the types of cargoes that buyers can accept. Traders say the move is creating uncertainty across the market. Some are rushing to sell off inventories before additional restrictions appear. Interestingly, despite the tensions, benchmark iron ore prices have actually risen, climbing above $108 per metric ton in recent trading. The reason is simple. Whenever trade restrictions appear, they can disrupt supply chains and tighten near-term availability. Elsewhere in the mining sector, another potential blockbuster development is quietly brewing. Executives at a major commodity trading and mining company are signaling they may try again to revive merger discussions with one of the world's largest mining firms. Earlier this year, talks about creating what could become the world's largest mining company collapsed over disagreements about valuation. But rising coal prices and shifting market dynamics may now strengthen the case for revisiting the deal later this year. Some investors remain skeptical, particularly in Australia, where concerns about governance and environmental positioning could complicate any future agreement. Turning now to agriculture, we're seeing multiple trade disruptions emerging at the same time. In Brazil, exporters are scrambling to resolve new inspection procedures affecting soybean shipments to China. Stricter sanitary checks requested by Chinese authorities are making it harder for traders to comply with export requirements. The timing could hardly be worse. Brazil is currently in the peak season for soybean exports, and China is by far its largest buyer. Last year alone, Chinese imports accounted for roughly 80% of Brazil's soybean exports. Meanwhile, in Europe, analysts have lowered forecasts for wheat and barley exports to the Middle East. The reason again comes back to the geopolitical shock affecting energy and shipping markets. If the conflict continues and energy prices remain elevated, grain demand could weaken in several importing regions, forcing further downward revisions to trade forecasts. Shipping disruptions are also hitting rice exports from India. Freight rates and insurance costs have surged as vessels avoid the Strait of Hormuz. Exporters say the rising costs are slowing new deals, even though India currently has ample rice supplies. In some cases, shipments of premium rice heading toward Middle Eastern markets are effectively stuck in transit, leaving sellers uncertain about delivery timelines and payment. And finally, let's talk about power markets, where a completely different kind of demand shock is unfolding. Electricity consumption in the United States is rising again after more than a decade of relatively flat demand. The driver is the rapid expansion of large data centers, which require enormous amounts of electricity to power artificial intelligence systems and cloud computing infrastructure. According to recent projections, electricity demand could grow by nearly 2% next year and even faster the year after that. If that trend accelerates, natural gas power generation could increase by more than 7% between 2025 and 2027. Ironically, that means fossil fuel generation may rise in the short term, even as renewable energy continues expanding. Wholesale power prices could also climb significantly, particularly in Texas, where the regional grid has limited connections to neighboring systems. Taken together, all of these developments paint a picture of a global commodity system navigating overlapping pressures. Geopolitical conflict is disrupting energy supplies, trade disputes are reshaping metals flows, agricultural shipments are facing regulatory and freight obstacles, and new technological demand is reshaping power markets. In other words, the world of commodities is entering a period where logistics, geopolitics, and structural demand shifts are becoming just as important as traditional supply and demand fundamentals. That's something we'll continue to watch very closely in the weeks ahead. And that brings us to the end of today's episode. If you found this episode valuable, be sure to subscribe, share, and leave a review. Thanks for listening to the Commodities Institute podcast. I'm Emily Costa, and I'll see you next time.